to transition here to our final speaker. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Katy Ruckle is the State Chief Privacy Officer for WATEC. She was appointed the state's Chief Privacy Officer on January 1st of 2020. She's published foundational privacy principles for Washington state agencies to incorporate into their data governance practices and increase training on privacy and data protection through monthly webinars. Katy previously served as the Privacy Officer and Information Governance Administrator at DSHS. She's a licensed attorney and was admitted to the Washington State Bar Association in 2005. She also holds certifications from the International Association of Privacy Professionals in U.S. privacy law and Privacy Program Management, the CIPM. She presently serves as a board member of the Government Lawyers Bar Association and volunteers as a mediator at the Pierce County Center for Dialogue and Resolution. I've had the pleasure of working with Katy for the past couple of years, and I always find her inspiring. So with that, I am going to invite Katy to come on camera and kick us off with your presentation.
Thanks, Stacy. Can you see me? I turned my camera on. Okay, let me share my presentation. Thanks so much for having me today. Let's see, can you see that? Can you hear me?
We can see you and hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk today about privacy considerations for project managers, and then specifically incorporating privacy into Agile methodologies, since that's the focus of today's conversation. And thank you so much, Stacy, for the kind introduction. I think we hit all the highlights in my career. I would just mention that I've been with the state for 16 years. And have also had the pleasure of working on a project as the business owner or system owner that at DSHS that used the Agile methodology. So today's presentation, I'm just going to go through what is privacy, how do we implement privacy, when does privacy need to be at the table, and what will we do if you invite us there? So first, I just want to do a little level setting in terms of what is privacy. So we talk about privacy as the right to be let alone, and it's really described as a person's ability to exercise control over how their personal information is collected and used. So for communication, we're thinking about protecting our correspondence, emails, those types of communications that we don't expect others to be able to see or being able to record or listen to us. Territorial privacy is really thinking about your own private home or personal space. Bodily privacy is feeling secure against invasion of your body. That includes things we might think about in terms of drug testing or body searches. And then for today's purposes, we're really talking about information privacy. And in thinking of projects for government agencies, this is where we typically mean privacy for projects in particular, and how we're handling either resident data or employee data. And we use the term PII, which it means personally identifiable information, and at its broadest definition, it really means is the information such that you can readily identify a specific individual. And so personal information can include things even as simple as a name is PII, but of course other items of personal information that we think of being more sensitive, like health information or social security numbers and those types of identifiers. So it's not a strict hierarchy in terms of the lines between laws and best practices, but I would encourage the thinking of privacy to be beyond what the laws and regulations are. Because if you're only thinking about compliance, privacy as a compliance piece, then you're missing some of the broader principles that I think apply to data handling and information governance. And then really what is the expectations of the public when we're handling personally identifiable information. So the Office of Privacy and Data Protection was actually created in 2016, and it was created statutorily, and RCW, which created my office and my position. And so the legislature gave the Office of Privacy and Data Protection specific duties, and I'm not going to go through all of these duties, but I do want to highlight a couple for today's purposes. And specifically, I want to talk about the fact that it is put in law that privacy should be a part of reviewing major state agency projects that involve personally identifiable information. We're also responsible for promoting best practices for the collection and storage of personally identifiable information. And then finally, we're tasked with articulating the privacy principles and best practices for state agencies. So we have articulated the Washington State Agency privacy principles. And if you're not familiar with these, I would note that I have a webinar on our website and also a document that gets into each of these, which we don't have time to go through all of them today. But I do want to highlight a couple that I think are specifically relevant for project managers, because project managers really can play a role in our accountability for the use of data, the purpose limitation, and potentially data minimization, and being sort of a good group to identify when privacy might need to be involved to help accomplish these principles. So one of the things that an example I use for data minimization, and I will also mention I was able to present to the National Conference of State Legislators just last week, and Senator Carlisle was there, and he spoke specifically to this concern for data minimization, is really being thoughtful in projects about whether or not you need the data, and being thoughtful about how long you need to retain the data, and when you should safely destroy or dispose of the data. Because we've had many, many instances recently, unfortunately, in the state, where we've had pretty large data breaches, where if a lot of the data that was kept was no longer needed and beyond retention, and it really increases our exposure and risk when that happens. An example that I like to use in terms of thinking about some of these principles is if you're thinking about whether or not you really need a full date of birth in order to accomplish the business purpose. This kind of gets to, I think we were talking about minimum viable products earlier, so that would be, what is the minimum viable information you need? Can you really just accomplish your purpose with the month and year? Do you actually need the full date of birth? And sometimes you do, but do you think about that every time, or do you just say date of birth and then incorporate that without thinking about whether you need that whole identifier, which then does create a risk? So there are some gaps between some of the privacy laws or legal requirements and what effective privacy controls are. So sometimes the laws do not establish enough protections to meet the public's expectations. And a good example of this is the fact that our data breach law in Washington does not actually require individuals to get credit monitoring when the state breaches their data. However, for the most part, when those incidents are occurring, the state is offering that protection. And so that's just an example where the legal requirements, the bare minimum, is not enough to actually, I think, meet the public's expectations or be an effective privacy control. And then the other part is that our laws don't keep pace with technology and business practices. And so that's where effective privacy controls, especially making sure we're incorporating those in projects, is very important. And they also don't account for a specific organization's mission or cultural context. So So a higher level way of thinking about this is when you're talking about compliance, you're inherently talking about the risks to the organization, but when you're implementing effective privacy practices, you should be thinking about the risks to the people. So how do we implement privacy? So there are similarities between privacy implementation and project management, but one of the threshold questions is really asking, does the project process personal data? Because if you're not processing personal data in any way, shape, or form, then probably privacy doesn't need to be at the table. And what do we mean by process? Processing means any operation or set of operations which are performed on personal data, which can include collection of data, use of data, storage of data, disclosure of data, analysis of data, deleting data, modifying personal data. And I didn't add this to the list, but I was reminded that accessing data is also a form of processing data. I would put that under use, but sometimes when we're working on projects or developing new APIs or interfaces, we may be allowing for access to data and not necessarily contemplating that that's a new use of the data that may need more attention for privacy controls. So when we're incorporating privacy into the project management methodologies, so I recognize that these are pictures of different, waterfall or Agile, and there are different waterfall pictures and different Agile steps as well, but this is just to demonstrate sort of the difference between going through a set standard process versus the iterative Agile process. But privacy issues may occur at any stage of both of these methodologies. But I want to mention that I think there are specific challenges that may come with the Agile methodology that I think, if we're incorporating privacy, that I think I just want to highlight and to pay attention to. And so the main issue, or I think a difference where incorporating privacy can be a little bit more of a challenge in Agile, is that with the waterfall method, you typically have requirements more fixed at the beginning of the project, so you're kind of able to define potentially security and privacy controls early on, and then you're moving on to the next part. Where Agile, the requirements are a little bit more flexible. You may not know all the requirements you need, and so that's why that can pose a little bit of a challenge in terms of making sure that you're able to expect and incorporate privacy controls accordingly with each iteration. So while the waterfall is built for more static requirements, Agile is applied to the dynamic requirements. But of course, privacy can be incorporated into both methodologies. So to deal with these challenges, you really need to think about how you're classifying the data. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 4 categories of classifying data in the state of Washington, from category 4 being the most restricted or sensitive, or I should say confidential data that typically has other laws that apply to it, like health information, healthcare information where HIPAA applies, or government identifiers, which are things like passport numbers or driver's license information. Category 2 is the more sensitive information, but it's also, I know we use the word sensitive, but it can be disclosable. So that's something that can be a little bit confusing there. But in terms of thinking about how you are classifying the data and when to involve privacy, that's one of the other questions that you're thinking about. Because if you're processing personal data, especially in the category 3 or category 4 areas, then you're going to want to make sure that you're thinking about the privacy controls that need to apply. And this is similar to the thinking that you are incorporating with security requirements as well. I also wanted to mention that if you're familiar with the NIST standards, the NIST privacy framework also says that privacy should be considered in all development life cycles. So for Agile, that makes privacy a consideration and iterative process like everything else. So a way to implement this is through the privacy by design principles. And there is 4 principles in particular that I want to talk about today that I think especially align with good project management. So the first principle is that I want to highlight is the privacy is embedded into the design, which means that it's built in and not bolted on. And that's also a phrase that we hear in regards to security. So just like using project management increases the likelihood of projects meeting desired requirements and being on time and staying within budget, embedding the privacy into the design ensures that you're protecting and thinking about the privacy considerations of processing personal data. The next principle that I wanted to highlight is the full functionality, or it's not a zero-sum game, is how we think about this particular privacy by design principle. And it really means that we're seeking to accommodate all the legitimate interests and objectives and avoiding the false pretense or false dichotomies, such as you have to sacrifice full functionality of your project for privacy or security. And this aligns with the objectives and making sure that they're clearly articulated in terms of being sure that you're not giving up control of, just because you're giving up control or just because you're using a project manager doesn't mean that you're giving up control of the project. So it means that everybody can work together to find the objectives that implement the project so successfully and the product successfully. So privacy as a default setting means that there's no action required on the part of the individual to making sure that they are able to protect their data. So it means that it's built into the system by default, and it's a standardized process, much like the standardized process and methodologies that we're talking about today. So privacy as a default setting essentially means that people aren't needing to opt out of having their data shared. It means that they're already making sure that their data is not being shared. And so that is a newer idea in terms of a lot of products, especially with the use of data. But I was going to highlight that there was an article in the Wall Street Journal recently, just last weekend, about Porsche essentially creating a button for drivers that says that they can opt out of sharing their data with the company, which means they're not tracking everything that you're doing in the vehicle, which is different from how most car manufacturers are working right now. So that's a good example of privacy as the default setting. And the last privacy by design principle that I wanted to highlight is being proactive and not reactive. So that means, that privacy is being thought of before and not after the fact. Just like we were talking about the importance of planning first in project management, this is a way to make sure that you're already taking care and addressing a lot of the risks and privacy controls and incorporating those privacy principles instead of dealing with it when there's a breach or more information is accessible to those that you don't mean to share with. So when does privacy need to be at the table? So there's a few potential triggers for involvement. And really, if you've answered that threshold question about is the project going to process personally identifiable information, then it's good to have privacy at conception. And that can be at a time when you're really deciding whether or not the information you need to accomplish the business purpose for the project should be collected. And I think also being involved early helps then establishes privacy involvement in the project, so that if, for instance, I think James was talking about a great example of the project only needing personal information at first, or natural people, but then you wanted to go back and add the business information. So if it was the inverse, where you decided you only needed business information, you didn't necessarily need personally identifiable information, but you had already involved the privacy people at the beginning, then you could make sure that if you had those relationships to make sure you're incorporating the personal, or helping identify where the privacy controls need to be. So another area where we're looking at helping to identify this is adding a question on the ITPA, which will ask whether or not the project contemplates processing personally identifiable information. Another trigger will be if you see that confidential information is being shared internally or with third parties, or whether or not you're executing data sharing agreements or contracts. And then this is the other piece to keep in mind, especially as Agile is an iterative process, that you're involving someone more than, you're involving privacy potentially at more than one time in the project. And I also wanted to share that we're doing a review right now of the security design review at WATEC, and there has been the recognition that a lot of the security design review questions or information they're gathering would fit more with a privacy impact assessment process. And so at that point, privacy may become involved in terms of helping flesh out some of the impacts of the data, so that the security design review process can focus on the technical security controls. So there's several stakeholders, I think, that are involved with incorporating privacy and data classification and handling throughout the project, if your project is processing personal data. And that initially it's, a privacy review, and then potentially engineering and development. I think especially when you're an instance that I had heard of recently at the federal level was development of a project where they had granted 200 engineers access to all of the production and personal information, where it wasn't really necessary that those many people had access to that information. And so that's another area to think about in terms of who needs the access to the data during the development cycle. And then of course, including stakeholders, or security for the security pieces. And then the other stakeholders, of course, can include the people that we've been talking about already today, including product design, user experience, data scientists, and I know Bill mentioned business owners especially. So after you've classified the data and determined whether or not there's laws that you need to deal with for the processing of the personal data, if you in the Agile process, if you've deployed, then you start to see the real user experiences. And this is helpful then to identify areas where you may need to address more privacy controls. So in that way, some of those approaches can help make sure that you're protecting information and having it processed in the way that I think the business expected it to. So part of the process challenge here is determining privacy risk for a system or a product that will exist later. And so part of what can be applied here is understanding where the personal data is and what sort of personal data is there to think about further protections and control. And so you may even be thinking about starting a data inventory at this point, and then maturing that inventory as you go. And that's really a data handling best practice, especially for if you're going to be tagging data and you start at the database level and then possibly build to the column level and then all of the data elements to monitor. So this is a little process sheet that I got from Gartner, and it may not be needed to do, especially if you're doing sprints in every 2-week cycle, to do this assessment with each sprint. But I would encourage thinking about, does the sprint involve the processing of personal data in a new way, or is it processing additional data that hadn't been considered earlier in terms of the privacy controls that are being built into the project? And so you may not have the data yet, but you're building something that will capture and process personal data. Or if you're thinking about new data workflows, this little mini assessment in a way for the sprints can help you identify whether or not you want to bring in a privacy professional to help think about some of the privacy controls or security controls that may be needed. So some of the questions that you can think about that I think also tie directly to the privacy principles are, what personal data are you collecting? Where is it coming from? Meaning, is data being shared from another agency, or is it being collected from individuals? Where will it be stored? And that gets into some of the offshore discussion. Who will have access? And then the purpose for collection, thinking about, why do you need it? And then how long are you going to retain it? And then I should add to that, and when will it be destroyed? Because that is these fundamental questions. I think if you're thinking about adding new features to projects and the project managers are seeing this happen, then that's when you can help to flag issues for privacy. So that's the benefit, really, is you're flagging potential new features of projects that for privacy review or detecting privacy issues, and then you're able to build in technical privacy requirements for specific parts of the project, and prioritization of your mitigation efforts, and then or consulting with privacy based on that assessment of answering those questions. And then the benefit is that the analysis the project can be based on discovered knowledge that you're learning from going through this process. You're embedding the privacy into the project for further iterations. So once you've gotten the project controls in there, you may not need privacy later because you've already built those in. And then you all have a better handle on the data classification and data handling standards. So if it does turn out that there are going to be larger privacy implications, then we would be performing something that's known as a privacy threshold analysis and a privacy impact assessment. And before you get concerned that this is going to stop a project, it's not. It's meant to improve a project. And this is the part that I was referring to earlier about marrying this with the security design review, is that then we have a much better comprehensive idea about the impacts, the potential privacy impacts of the project, and then how security needs to work with privacy. And I will just highlight, in case you have questions about how privacy works with security, and I say that privacy should be working closely with security and collaborating closely and making sure that what we're saying aligns with the security piece that is coming for the project. And of course, the intersection between privacy and cybersecurity typically is when you do have an incident. And when I was talking with some project managers about this yesterday, we were talking about some incidents where things had happened during projects, and this included potentially using live data or real data for test environments, or which is not a good practice. Or the other issue where I've seen a breach in this area too is when you're creating manuals and you have screenshots of systems, and then those screenshots include live data. So I've had to deal with that a couple of times where those manuals get posted online, and then it turns out it's somebody's actual data, and then we need to handle it as a breach. So those are a couple of examples of where privacy gets involved, maybe sometimes too late when we're not thinking about best practices in this area. We want to avoid that. So I have been involved in projects that I'm sure you've heard of, the M365 implementation, and our office was involved in the One WA project as well. We also are currently involved in the cloud program development and the identity access management process. And so I just wanted to highlight that we are starting to involve privacy in these projects and having thoughtful conversations about how to make sure we're addressing privacy in our projects in Washington. So just for a quick summary, I talked about, what is privacy, how we implement it, when to think about inviting privacy, and what will privacy do. So I will encourage you to help identify when personal data is being processed in the sprint and then classifying that data appropriately so that privacy controls can be addressed in the iterative cycle. So if you leave with anything today from what I'm talking about, I would just print out the slide to remind yourself, does the project or sprint process personal data? If so, is it a new processing of personal data or additional personal data? And then if so, thinking about some of these high-level questions to help identify the potential privacy risks of processing the data. So, and I did just want to highlight why privacy is so important. It is a right. In the state of Washington, it's in our state constitution. It's been identified as a human right, and I recently blogged about the fact that I still believe that there's ample reason to find privacy is implied in our U.S. Constitution. And then it's the focus of lawmakers, not only at the U.S. congressional level, but also in our state. And so I just want to make sure we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're handling our residents' data appropriately and our employee data. So if you want additional information on some of the areas that I talked about today, you can go to my website under Government Agency Resources. Specifically, I would call out two presentations on our website, which include a presentation on the Washington State Agency Privacy Principles and sort of a deep dive into each of those principles. And the slide decks are also available there. And then also there's a presentation on privacy impact assessments and kind of gives more background about what those are. And if you want to subscribe to my blog, this is how you do it on the website. And I am wrapping up a few minutes early. I went through everything quickly, so I don't know if there's time for questions, but thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. There is definitely questions. Sorry. Doesn't sound good.
We have a question. Oops. I'm going to remute it.
Thanks, Rochelle. Elizabeth, love to have your question.
Yeah, Katie, you talked about during a project getting a privacy professional involved. Who would that person be? Is that you guys, or is that you need another consultant involved, or what do you mean by that?
Oh, can't hear you, Katie. You might have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Thanks,
Yes.
Elizabeth. Yes, so you can contact us. We are trying to build that capacity for our office, and we are involved, as I talked about, we are involved in some of the larger state projects. But you can reach out to us to involve us, but also many of your agencies do have privacy professionals as well, and we work with that community. And so even if they're not sure initially, we're happy to be a resource to the resource to help make sure everything's being addressed the way it needs to be.
Thanks, Katie. Anyone else have a question for Katie? James.
So I have to say, Katie, I love your comment about date of birth and minimum viable. I don't think that the developers would ever even consider that, because minimum viable is usually about effort. And in many cases, it would be harder to not get the whole date of birth than to just get month and year. And so, you know, maybe we need minimum viable data. And sometimes that can be harder.
Yes, but not a reason to not try, and sort of try to start thinking that way about the data, and not just collecting everything because you can, or you're used to doing it that way, or your columns already format in that, month, year, date method. And so that's where we need to start trying to, minimize what we're collecting, because it really is becoming, more and more of an issue.
Thanks for that question, James. Elizabeth, did you have another question, or did you not lower your hand?
I just had a comment about that. That was why I was asking about the privacy professional, because I know that my clients have good, solid understanding of privacy. They often have privacy, people that focus on privacy, but putting it into, your iterative process, that takes, and doing exactly what you just said, during the process of, the sprints, that's like a special expertise that our privacy people would probably not have. So that's kind of what I was asking about, like, who has that? Who could come in and help and explain that?
Yeah, we're happy to help in that area. I do think that a lot of the privacy professionals out there that I work with would know to be asking about, data minimization. That's a core principle that we have in the state. But part of today's presentation is to help everybody become aware and start thinking about data and privacy and personal data in that way, because this community especially, I think, has a view into projects early that a lot of privacy people don't. And then what happens is we find out at the end of something, and then that gets to be the problem with the bolting on, or having to reprogram or redevelop, and really costing time at the end, where if it was addressed up front and early in the project, then it's already taken care of, and it does save you time and energy and risk.
Thank you, Katie. Saidi, you have the question for the group?
Quick question for Katie. Katie, I know that we have a security audit today as new projects are launched, which is great because obviously security is important. Would you consider, or even thinking about, having a privacy audit, either part of the security audit or a separate process, when new mega projects are launched in the state that addresses and also protects citizens' privacy?
So I'm not sure what you mean by the audit, but I think, so we are trying to implement the privacy threshold analysis and privacy impact assessment as a part of the security design review. Okay. And part of the security design review is looking at the type of data and the sensitivity and confidentiality level of the data, and then also the laws that apply to that data. And so, because that dictates the security controls, but the privacy piece is also a part of that, because while security is looking at locking everything down, the privacy assessment is really looking at the purpose, and that's the purpose for collection initially, and that's not always a consideration of security. So I do think those two processes need to be linked together. Yeah,
so I'm thinking for you to move forward with your vision for private Washingtonian data, so we will have to have it formally done, right? Which you said is being done as part of the security review, right?
Yes, that is the direction we're heading. I'm socializing it today.
Thanks.
You heard it here first. Any other questions for Katie? I learned a few things today, Katie, so thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation and all of the great information.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.